Hello, everyone. Tonight, we are floating, quite literally, over the still waters of a lake that no longer fully exists. Picture it a vast expanse of shimmering blue at dawn, broken only by the gentle glide of a reed canoe, the sound of a wooden paddle dipping rhythmically into water, and the soft rustle of tule grasses along the shore. The morning mist still hugs the surface, and somewhere in the distance, a heron rises like a drifting thought. But don't get too cozy. This is Lake Texcoco in the Valley of Mexico, and unless you can build a raft out of mud and aquatic weeds in under an hour, you probably won't survive this place for long. The Aztecs, or more precisely their predecessors, were surrounded by swampland, salty marshes, and more mosquitoes than any god should allow. Yet somehow, they figured it out. They turned one of the most waterlogged, unstable regions in Mesoamerica into a sustainable food engine that could feed hundreds of thousands of people. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I'm doing here. And while you're at it, drop a comment with your location and the local time. I always love seeing who's falling asleep from where. Now, turn off the lights, maybe turn on the fan for some soothing noise, and let's get down to business tonight. So I'm dragging my feet along the murky edge of a vanished lake, what used to be Lake Texcoco. Imagine it, before the Spanish drained it, before Mexico City paved over it with concrete and car horns. Back then, it was everything a mirror to the sky, a reservoir of life, and a logistical nightmare. You had freshwater springs bubbling up on the east side, salty waters creeping in from the west, and a seasonal temperament that could drown you by August. But here's the thing. People lived here. Not just lived, they thrived. And not by building towering monuments or writing epic poetry. Though yes, they did some of that too, but by figuring out how to grow lettuce on a lake. That's right. The story of Chinampas, those famous floating gardens, starts not with kings or conquests, but with mud. Glorious, nutrient-rich, backbreaking mud. Early Mesoamericans, long before the Mexica, what we call the Aztecs, looked out at all this water and thought, yeah, let's farm here. And somehow, instead of getting stuck in the muck, they created islands. They started by weaving together mats of reeds, anchoring them with willow trees, and piling on layer after layer of lakebed mud until the whole thing could support corn stalks, beans, and squash. Think of it as a giant lasagna made out of dirt sticks and ambition. And the smell. Oh, buddy. If you've ever walked through a wetlands park and thought, wow, nature smells funky today, multiply that by 10. We're talking anaerobic decay, frog burps, and the ghost of 1,000 fish. But apparently, the plants loved it. The location was perfect in a twisted sort of way. Lake Texcoco wasn't entirely fresh water. It was brackish, meaning it had a high salt content in many areas. But in certain spots, especially near the springs or the shallower zones, fresh water pooled just enough to sustain life. These were the Goldilocks zones for Chinampa development. Now here's a weird fact. The Aztecs didn't actually invent the Chinampa. They adopted it. Historians still debate whether the technology began with the Xochimilca, a neighboring people with a flair for soggy real estate, or whether it was an even older innovation passed down through generations. Either way, the Mexica, what we'll call the Aztecs from now on, did what they always did best. They took something brilliant and scaled it up like mad. By the time the Spanish arrived in the early 1500s, the Chinampa zone stretched across miles of interconnected canals, an endless patchwork of green islands, each one roughly 2.5 meters wide and up to 100 meters long. If that sounds weirdly specific, it's because the Aztecs had regulations. You don't build an empire without zoning laws. Picture me canoeing slowly between rows of floating farm plots. On one side, there are broad-leafed squash vines curling like lazy snakes across the soil. On the other, thin bean stalks stretch upwards on woven stick lattices chasing the morning sun. Overhead, dragonflies skim the water, and underfoot tiny fish dart between submerged roots. Occasionally, you'll spot a little hut at the edge of a Chinampa part tool shed, part meditation room. Some plots even had scarecrows. Yes, ancient Mexican scarecrows, not exactly the stuff of horror movies, but probably enough to freak out a duck. Speaking of ducks, we'll get to them later. The beauty of the Chinampa wasn't just its cleverness, it was its rhythm. Each day began early, just as the fog lifted. Farmers paddled out from their homes, many of which were built on firmer land nearby, or even directly on the Chinampas themselves, and got to work sowing, weeding, harvesting. There was a grace to it, like farming on a lily pad. Messy, sure, but elegant in its own mucky way. And here's a thing they figured out early on. The more you dredged nutrient-rich muck from the lake bottom and added it to your Chinampa, the better your plants grew. It was like compost before compost was a hipster thing. The lake itself became the fertilizer bin. Of course, nothing's perfect. The main downside, mosquitoes. I mean, it was like their Coachella. If you weren't covered in bites by noon, congratulations, you were dead. And while we're on that note, floating plots were secure, yes, but they weren't totally immune to storms. Heavy rains could flood the canals and unmoor the weaker Chinampasa, sending your carefully planted tomatoes sailing off into the sunset. Still, it worked. So well, in fact, that Chinampa agriculture produced up to 7 harvests a year. 7. That's more than most modern industrial farms can manage, and all without chemical fertilizers or GPS-guided tractors. Just mud time and maybe a few whispered prayers to Tlaloc the rain god. And this brings us to the bigger picture. The lake was not just a natural feature. It was a living infrastructure system. Imagine a landscape where roads were water neighborhoods, floated, and soil had to be built from scratch. That was Lake Texcoco. It was a place where human ingenuity bloomed like morning glories on a bed of silt. And tonight, we're going to sink into it, layer by layer. Just don't forget your paddle or your mosquito net. I'm squelching through mud again, thick, sticky, unforgiving stuff that clings to your ankles like it's trying to pull you back in time. And maybe that's exactly what it's doing. Because to really understand how Chinampas were born, you've got to start not with the Aztecs or even agriculture, but with a question. What happens when you try to farm in a swamp? Spoiler alert, everything sinks, or rots, or both. But here's where it gets interesting. Somewhere around 1000 CE, give or take, a century or 3 early Mesoamerican communities in the Valley of Mexico began to experiment. These weren't sprawling cities yet. They were modest lake-hugging settlements that needed food and didn't have the patience to wait for dry land. So they turned to what they had: mud reeds and raw, stubborn curiosity. The first step: reeds. Lots of them. People wove mats from tule reeds and tied them together with cords made from agave fibers. Then they'd anchor the mats into place using ahuejote trees, a kind of fast-growing willow, with roots tougher than most people's work ethic. These trees weren't just decoration. They stabilized the whole thing, creating a living frame to hold the future Chinampa in place. Roots went down, mats stayed put, and the dream of not drowning while farming came alive. Once you had your frame, it was time for the fun part: mud wrestling. Farmers dredged up thick layers of lakebed muck, full of decaying vegetation, fish poop, and dreams. They piled it onto the reed mats, along with dead plants, branches, and whatever else they could find. Imagine stacking lasagna in a canoe, praying it doesn't capsize. Layer by layer, the floating platforms took shape. Mud, reeds, plant debris. Repeat. Over time, these floating plots grew heavier and heavier, eventually becoming semi-permanent islands rooted into the lake bottom. Not quite land, not quite raft. A living contradiction. And they worked. Plants actually grew on these things, well. But here's the weird part. Nobody agrees on who actually did this first. Historians still debate whether the Xochimilca invented the Chinampa, or whether the technique goes even farther back, maybe to the Toltecs, or even earlier civilizations. There's no ancient blueprint, no how to build a swamp farm for dummies lying around, just the lingering evidence in sediment and oral tradition. What we do know is this: the system caught on. Fast. And like all good ideas, it evolved. Eventually, the design got fancier. Instead of floating mats, people started creating permanent islands by staking out long rectangular sections of shallow lake with sticks enclosing the area, with woven fences, and filling the space inside with alternating layers of lake mud and vegetation until the whole thing rose slightly above the water. Think of it like laying out a big muddy lasagna and baking it under the sun until it held its shape. It sounds ridiculous, but it was genius. Chinampas were self-irrigating. Water seeped in from the canals on either side, keeping the soil perpetually moist. Nutrients were constantly replenished by lake silt. There was no need for rain dances, although I imagine Tlaloc the rain god appreciated the backup gigs. And because these gardens were built in long, narrow rows, with canals in between, transportation was as easy as paddling a canoe. No oxen needed, no bumpy roads, just drift and harvest. It was like having DoorDash, but in reverse, you delivered your veggies by boat. Let's take a second to appreciate the scale of this thing. A single Chinampa plot could be up to 100 meters long and 2.5 to 3 meters wide. Multiply that by thousands, and you've got a whole floating city of agriculture. A green patchwork quilt stitched together with water and willow roots. Also, it turns out mud is a fantastic building material if you're patient and your expectations are low. I once tried to make a mud brick in summer camp. It cracked within 12 minutes and gave me tetanus-adjacent vibes. But these ancient Mesoamericans, they used mud like it was divine clay, and they kept going, building, experimenting, innovating even when floods tried to wipe it all away. Of course, it wasn't all smooth rowing. Every once in a while, the lake would throw a tantrum, overflowing its boundaries, drowning crops, sending poorly built Chinampas drifting off like confused ducks. There were predators too, not jaguars or crocodiles, but swarms of insects, hungry birds, and whatever lake creature thought your tomato vine looked delicious. Yet despite the odds, the system worked. In fact, it worked so well that the Aztecs later adopted it wholesale and scaled it up to feed their expanding empire. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's talk about the smell. Yes, I know that's not typically how history textbooks guide you into the past, but bear with me. These Chinampa zones were essentially giant compost heaps floating in shallow warm water. They reeked of life. Not life in the floral, butterfly kisses on a breeze sense, but life in the someone just left fish guts in the sun sense. And yet there's something comforting about it. The stink of fermentation of nature breaking itself down and building itself back up. It's the smell of fertility, of potential. You either get used to it or you stop having a nose. Now, some of the earliest adopters of this system didn't just plant crops. They also cultivated obsidian tools, clay figurines, and spiritual talismans right there on the Chinampas. Archaeologists have found offerings buried deep in the soil suggesting that farming wasn't just economic, it was sacred. These weren't just gardens. They were temples in disguise, places where maize met magic, and maybe that's why they lasted. Chinampas weren't just convenient, they were embedded in worldview, in ritual, in daily rhythm. You weren't just feeding your family. You were tending the skin of the earth itself. I sometimes imagine what it must have felt like paddling out at sunrise, mist curling around your canoe, the water still except for the ripple of oars. You reach your plot, tuck your paddle under one arm, and begin to work the soil, rich black, impossibly fertile. No fertilizer bags, no irrigation pumps. Just you, your hands, and the mud that remembers. And just maybe if you're lucky, the ducks will leave your squash alone today. The sun's just beginning to rise over the Chinampasas, and I'm already sweating through my tunic. The lake is still the water, glistening like polished obsidian, and the faint sound of birdsong echoes off the canal walls. This is breakfast time for the ducks, the dragonflies, and the plants. And if you were an Aztec gardener standing on your long, muddy island, surrounded by shimmering canals, chances are you were checking on your three sisters. No, not your cousins. I mean corn beans and squash, three crops that weren't just food, they were family. This wasn't random planting. This was an intentional, symbiotic setup that bordered on genius. Corn shoots up tall and proud, a little arrogant, if we're being honest. Beans spiral upward, wrapping themselves around the cornstalk like they're in a romantic drama. And squash sprawls across the ground like your friend who refuses to get off the couch, shading the soil and keeping it moist. Together they create a kind of agricultural harmony that modern scientists still gush over. These three plants didn't just tolerate each other, they helped each other thrive. The beans fixed nitrogen into the soil. The corn gave the beans a natural trellis, and the squash leaves shaded the soil, blocking weeds and preserving water. And when I say nitrogen fixing, I don't mean it had a wrench and a toolbox. I mean the beans literally pulled nitrogen from the air and shared it like the best kind of neighbor. If you're thinking, wow, that sounds like permaculture, congratulations. You've just discovered that the Aztecs were doing sustainable agriculture before it was cool. But they didn't stop at the three sisters. Chinampas were bursting with edible diversity. Tomatoes, chili peppers, amaranth herbs like epazote and cilantro, even flowers like marigolds, which were sometimes edible and always good at making your garden look extra photogenic. And then there were the oddballs crops you don't typically hear about in world history class, like chaya, a leafy green that had to be cooked to remove toxins, but was loaded with protein and vitamins, or huozontle, a spindly plant that looked like quinoa's wild cousin, and was often fried in batter, like a pre-Hispanic tempura. The Aztecs ate like culinary wizards with a swamp pantry. Of course, farming in a chinampa wasn't just about throwing seeds around and hoping for the best. There was serious technique involved: timing, spacing, rotation. Some plots were staggered so that while one was sprouting new corn, another was being harvested, and a third was lying fallow under a cover crop of beans. It was like a synchronized dance, but with more mud and fewer costumes. Historians still debate whether this system was deliberately rotated based on lunar cycles or simply managed through practical experience passed down from generation to generation. Some evidence suggests that farmers used the Aztec calendar, a 260-day ritual cycle known as the Tonalphualli, to decide when to plant or harvest. Others argue that it was more intuitive, more you listen to the plants and they tell you kind of wisdom. Either way, the results were stunning. Chinampa agriculture could produce 7 harvests per year. That's not a typo. 7. I know people who can't keep a basil plant alive for 2 weeks, and these ancient farmers were out here turning swamp dirt into perpetual salad bars. Let's pause for a moment and talk about water. You might assume that growing crops in a lake would make irrigation a non-issue, but it was a little more complicated than that. You couldn't just let your plants drown in soggy soil. Roots need oxygen. That's why Chinampa builders were so careful about layering materials, mud then sticks, then more mud, to create spaces for air and drainage. It was less of a field and more of a living sponge. Also, no matter how eco-savvy you were, things got moldy. That's just the price of growing vegetables in a floating compost lasagna. Every now and then, a Chinampa plot would need to be refreshed, scraped, or even rebuilt. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. Like changing the oil in your car, except your engine is made of corn, and your mechanic is a barefoot farmer named Itzquintly. Even the pests were manageable. The canals attracted frogs, fish, and birds, many of which helped control insect populations. It wasn't perfect. There were still weevils, aphids, and the occasional tomato-munching rodent, but it was a balanced ecosystem. The farmers didn't fight nature. They invited it in and gave it a job. And there was another layer, literally. Underneath the surface of the soil, these plots were alive with microbial activity. No one in Tenochtitlan was using the word microbiome, but they were living it. The breakdown of organic matter released nutrients back into the soil, creating a constant feedback loop of fertility. It was like compost irrigation and pest control, all rolled into one platform. A sort of swampy Swiss Army knife. And let's not forget the aesthetics. Chinampas were beautiful. A mosaic of color and texture. Green bean tendrils, yellow squash, blossoms, red chili fruits, purple amaranth leaves. The narrow canals reflected the sky, broken only by canoes gliding silently past. It was agriculture, as art functional spiritual, and sometimes a little muddy around the edges. I imagine standing on the edge of one of those floating gardens, the air thick with humidity and the scent of herbs. Maybe a farmer is humming, wiping sweat from his brow as he harvests chili peppers. In the background, a child chases a duck that's not supposed to be there. It's peaceful, industrious, and grounded, even though it's technically floating. And then there's the food. Oh, the food. A typical meal sourced from a Chinampa might include maize tortillas, squash stew, beans with herbs, roasted chilies, and maybe a dollop of fermented sap, or a tamale wrapped in corn husks. It wasn't just nutritious, it was a feast. Rich, spicy, and deeply tied to the land or water in this case. The more I learn about Chinampa farming, the more I realize how much we underestimate pre-modern knowledge. These weren't accidental discoveries. This was the product of generations of observation, trial, error, and a willingness to work with the natural world rather than against it. So next time someone brags about their hydroponic basil garden, you can nod politely and think the Aztecs were farming circles around you while standing in mud with no Wi-Fi. And they probably looked better doing it. I'm wiping imaginary sweat from my brow as the morning unfolds on the Chinampas. It's still early, but the day's already humming. Somewhere nearby, the squawk of a heron cuts through the humid air, and the wooden groan of a canoe being pushed off its moorings echoes across the canal. It's time for another day in the life of a Chinampa farmer, and let me tell you, this isn't a job for anyone who likes dry socks. The sun climbs slowly, lighting up long rows of green floating fields. From a distance, it all looks like a checkerboard stitched into the lake. Up close, it's a mess of tangled vines, squishy soil, and the occasional wayward frog. If you lived in a Chinampa-based neighborhood, your commute to work wasn't a walk, it was a paddle. You'd step into your canoe before sunrise your breath making little clouds in the crisp morning air. Paddle out, navigate the quiet canals like you're sneaking through nature's hallways and drift up to your farm plot. Maybe your brother's already there, trying to scare off the ducks again. Maybe your grandmother is tending to the chili peppers because she doesn't trust you not to pick them too early. And yes, she's probably right. The work starts with a look around. What's growing well? What needs water? Or more accurately, what needs a little less water today? Are the beans curling too tightly? Are the squash vines choking out the tomatoes? And what's that buzzing sound? Oh, just the crickets again. Crickets were everywhere. They were practically your co-workers, along with frogs, dragonflies, and little fish that splashed through the canals like tiny aquatic commuters. Some days, it felt like the entire ecosystem was whispering to itself, while you just tried not to trip over a gourd. Most of the work was hands-on. You dug into the soft Chinampa soil with wooden tools, carefully lifting weeds so you wouldn't disturb the roots of your crops. You pinched off damaged leaves, checked for insect eggs, and tucked vulnerable plants under shade when the sun got too intense. Everything was manual. No tractors, no sprayers, no irrigation pumps. Just human backs, calloused hands, and a whole lot of listening to what the plants were telling you. And speaking of manual labor, let's talk about the harvest. Harvesting in a Chinampa wasn't like pulling vegetables out of a tidy raised bed in your backyard. It was muddy, slippery, and occasionally involved you falling face first into a pile of onions. You moved slowly, balancing in the narrow space between soil and water, stacking fresh produce into baskets that would be loaded onto canoes. If you were lucky, the baskets didn't tip over on the paddle home. But what you gathered pure gold: corn ears fat with kernels, beans coiled like green question marks, squash the size of small furniture. Add in herbs, flowers, and edible greens, and it was like packing a salad bar into every canoe. Now, you weren't just growing this stuff for yourself. A lot of it went straight to market. Farmers often traveled into Tenochtitlan, the heart of the Aztec world, bringing their goods to the tianguis, massive open-air marketplaces that buzzed with trade gossip and the occasional argument over the price of guavas. If your produce looked good, you sold fast. If not, well, good luck competing with the Chinampa plot across the canal that somehow always had shinier chili peppers. But farming life wasn't just dirt and vegetables. It was woven into the rhythm of family and community. Kids played in the shallow canal edges, scooping up minnows with woven baskets. Grandparents shared stories of the old gods and how certain plants were sacred. At night, the entire family gathered for meals made from whatever the Chinampa had offered that day. Stews, tamales, chili sauces that could knock the sleep out of a jaguar. And in between all that ritual, you see, in Aztec culture, farming wasn't just practical. It was spiritual. You didn't plant corn without asking the blessing of Sentiotl, the maize god. You didn't take from the earth without giving something back, even if it was just a whispered thanks or a pinch of ash to the soil. Farmers often left small offerings, flowers, bits of food, even feathers at the edge of their plots. The Chinampa wasn't just a workplace. It was sacred space. One curious practice involved tracking the calendar with the help of local priests. Certain days were deemed lucky for planting, others for harvesting. There were rituals for rain, for fertility, for protection from pests. Sometimes a farmer would consult a tonopukay, a calendar priest, before making big planting decisions. Superstition, maybe. But when your entire year's food supply depends on weather ducks and the mood of the gods, you take every little bit of help you can get. Oh, and about the ducks. You'd think floating farms would be peaceful, right? But every Chinampa farmer had a nemesis, and that nemesis was the duck. Ducks loved the canals. They also loved your beans, and your squash, and anything else they could peck. You could try to scare them off with clapping, shouting, or building scarecrows from reeds and feathers, but they always came back. It was like farming in a constant feathery war zone. Still ducks weren't the worst problem. That title went to the weather. Some years the rainy season came too early and flooded the plots. Other times it didn't come at all and left canals half empty, thick with algae and disappointment. The farmers adapted as best they could, reinforcing embankments, dredging mud, praying more fervently. And yet, despite the struggles, there was a certain beauty in it all, a kind of slow magic. Life on the Chinampa wasn't flashy or easy, but it was rich. Every day, you touched the earth, or at least the mud that tried to be earth. Every meal you ate was something you or your neighbors had grown. You could point to a chili pepper and say, "Yeah, I raised that," and then maybe cough violently when you tasted it. It was a life of rhythm. Paddle, plant, harvest, eat, rest, repeat. And while the rest of the Aztec Empire might be off building pyramids or conquering rival city-states, here on the Chinampas you just kept showing up for your vegetables, which in the grand scheme of things might have been more revolutionary than any temple. I'm leaning over the edge of a Chinampa now, one hand buried in the dark, cool soil, the other brushing against a bean vine that curls up a wooden trellis like it's trying to tell me a secret. The water laps softly at the banks, and somewhere off in the distance a child is singing or maybe yelling at a goose. Hard to tell the difference, but I'm focused on the plants, because here's something wild. The Aztecs understood plant psychology. Okay, maybe not in the send your squash to therapy kind of way, but they grasped instinctively and practically that plants thrived under certain social arrangements. Companion planting, crop spacing, seasonal pairings. They weren't just planting seeds, they were orchestrating a green symphony. Let's take spacing for instance. Aztec farmers knew that cramming too many maize stalks together made them weak and stringy, so they spaced them just right, not too far. To waste land, not too close to fight over sunlight. Beans needed support, but too much shade, no dice. So they planted them just on the sunny side of the corn rows. Squash. That one got free rein to sprawl over everything like a sunbathing lizard. It wasn't chaos. It was choreography. And don't even get me started on marigolds. These bright little flowers weren't just for show. They repelled insects. Their scent confused the noses of hungry bugs, and their roots released compounds that discouraged nematodes, tiny pests that loved to ruin your week. So the Aztecs tucked them in between veggies, like bouncers at a nightclub. Stylish and useful. This whole system relied on intimate observation. No microscopes. No weather apps. Just generations of watching, remembering, and whispering advice across the canoe. And then there's the soil itself, the soul of the Chinampa. Unlike modern farming that often exhausts the ground, Chinampas were built to renew themselves. Remember the layered construction mud plant madder reeds? That wasn't just structure, it was strategy. As the organic material broke down, it fed the next crop. Every dead leaf, every stray fish scale, every bit of rotting vegetation became nutrients. You didn't clear the debris, you welcomed it. The smell was questionable. The results were not. And the water? Oh, the water was alive. These canals weren't just irrigation ditches. They were nutrient loops. As fish and aquatic plants decomposed, they created a broth of microbial goodness that seeped gently into the soil. The Aztecs may not have known the names of the bacteria doing the work, but they knew enough to keep the system balanced. Here's where it gets spooky smart. Some Chinampa farmers placed floating plant mats on the canals between plots, miniature wetlands that filtered the water naturally. These mats absorbed excess nutrients, filtered out sediment, and even provided habitat for frogs, which helped control insects. Today, we call this constructed wetlands. Back then, it was just Tuesday. Historians still debate whether these water purification techniques were widespread or just local innovations. But there's growing evidence. Archaeobotanical data pollen traces even old glyphs that suggest this wasn't accidental. The Aztecs were managing ecosystems before the word ecosystem was a twinkle in a scientist's eye. And speaking of systems, the roots of the plants themselves played a huge role in holding everything together. You can't just pile mud on a reed mat and hope it doesn't dissolve. But once the roots of corn beans and willows wove themselves into the base layers, the whole structure became a living net. The plants weren't just growing on the Chinampa. They were the Chinampa. It's kind of beautiful, really. A floating garden held together by the very things it grows. Let me paint you a scene. You're kneeling in the dirt, your hands caked in soil that smells of fish and lilies. The sun is beating down, and a dragonfly lands briefly on your sleeve before zipping off to patrol the canal. Beside you, a squash vine stretches toward the water like it's trying to make a run for it. You take a moment to admire the delicate hairs on the underside of a leaf, how they shimmer in the light, and think, yeah, I helped make this happen. Then a duck steals your tomato, and the moment's ruined. Still, that quiet awe never goes away. The more you worked the Chinampa, the more you noticed its moods. Some days, the soil felt warmer than usual, signaling a good harvest ahead. Other days, the roots were waterlogged and stubborn, warning you of rain to come. It was a living calendar, a barometer, a weather app, in the form of bean sprouts. And while the plants grew silently, the people did not. Farmers would often hum or sing as they worked. Not just for entertainment, but as a kind of rhythm. It helped pass the hours and kept their movements in sync. If you've ever weeded a field while singing, you'll know it helps. Plus, the plants probably enjoyed the company. Some even believed that talking to your crops helped them grow. Sound far-fetched. Modern studies have shown that certain frequencies can influence plant growth. Maybe they were onto something. Or maybe they just needed someone to talk to after a full day of duck-based trauma. Now, not every plant on the Chinampa was edible. Some were planted just to improve the soil or attract pollinators. Others were medicinal, like Tlalcaquetzal, a local herb used to treat fevers, or Mexican mint. Marigold, used for digestive issues. You didn't just grow food, you grew health. And here's the poetic twist. Even in the face of empire conquest and flood, these floating gardens kept growing. They were resilient, self-sustaining. As long as there were hands to pull mud and plant seeds, they bounced back. You could tear down a temple, but you couldn't argue with fresh squash. To this day, scientists studying Chinampas are amazed at how efficient they were. Some modern urban farms try to replicate the model, but few can match the productivity or elegance of this ancient system. It wasn't just low-tech, it was no-tech, and it worked. I can't help but think about that, about how the simplest ideas, rooted in patience and observation, often outlast the grandest inventions. In a world that's always trying to speed things up, the Chinampa whispers a different kind of wisdom. Grow slowly. Let your roots hold the system together. Welcome the ducks, even if they ruin your peppers. I'm standing on the edge of a Chinampa again, but this time I'm not alone. All around me are signs of life, not just plants, but people. Houses with reed-thatched roofs rise just beyond the nearest canal. Smoke drifts from tiny hearths. Children laugh as they splash water at each other from opposite canoes, and someone's beating maize with a stone matat in the distance, the sound rhythmically grounding the scene. These aren't isolated farm plots anymore. They're part of something much bigger. By the time the Aztecs had consolidated their empire and Tenochtitlan was booming, Chinampas weren't just farming innovations, they were community foundations. Whole neighborhoods emerged along the canal networks. Floating farms, yes, but also floating villages. Imagine a suburb where the streets were water, the sidewalks were squash vines, and your neighbor's ducks were your biggest annoyance. These Chinampa-based communities were connected not by dusty roads, but by canoe lanes. People didn't walk to the market, they paddled. If your cousin lived 2 plots down, you didn't shout across a fence, you drifted by with a basket of tamales and a casual wave. You lived in rhythm with the water, and the sound of paddles knocking gently against wood was your morning soundtrack. And yet, even with all this practicality, there was ritual, so much ritual. Every Chinampa, no matter how small, existed in the sacred web of the Aztec cosmos. Farming here wasn't a separate task from religion. It was a direct expression of it. Your crop rows lined up with solar movements. Your planting days were chosen based on the sacred Tonalpohualli calendar. You gave offerings to Tlaloc, god of rain, and Chicomacoatl, goddess of agriculture. And when the maize sprouted tall and proud, you thanked the gods with incense and songs. There's evidence that some Chinampa communities had shrines built right on the plots, small altars made of stone or clay, where farmers could leave tokens of gratitude. A maize doll, a handful of flowers, a splash of pulque, because even the gods deserve a drink now and then. Now, you might be thinking, how spiritual can digging in mud really be? But for the Aztecs, the earth wasn't just dirt. It was alive. Every seed planted was a pact with the gods. Every harvest was a form of sacred reciprocity. And every failure, drought, rot storm was a reminder that the balance could shift at any moment. And that balance was everything. Let's talk about social balance for a moment. Chinampa communities were tightly knit. Everyone depended on everyone else. One plot might grow maize, the next beans, the next medicinal herbs. Farmers traded among themselves, bartered at the local market, and shared water management duties. If a canal got clogged, it was everyone's problem. If ducks destroyed someone's pepper patch, well, you helped rebuild, and then you cooked the duck. The canals themselves were carefully managed. You couldn't just build a Chinampa wherever you felt like it. The entire lake system was part of a regulated infrastructure, with water channels cleared regularly to keep the flow going. Too much water. Flood. Too little drought. The stakes were high, and cooperation wasn't optional, it was survival. Some Chinampa neighborhoods even had designated water watchers, people who monitored levels, managed small dams, and coordinated seasonal dredging. Today, we call them hydrologists. Back then, they were your cousin Tepostli and his impressive collection of mud-stained sandals. And despite the backbreaking labor, the lifestyle had its comforts. Homes near Chinampas were well ventilated thanks to the canals. The water helped regulate temperature, cooled the air, and even served as a natural pantry. Some people kept baskets submerged in the canals to preserve food, like a watery refrigerator. Others hung herbs to dry on strings between willow trees, turning their plots into floating apothecaries. There was a rhythm to everything. Sunrise meant checking the crops. Midday meant rest under shade or a communal meal with neighbors. Evenings brought ritual songs, marketplace stories, and the occasional flute performance by someone who maybe wasn't as talented as they thought, but who got polite applause anyway. Life moved to the pace of the sun, the crops, and the occasional neighborhood duck chase. And at the heart of it all, Tenochtitlan. This city wasn't just the capital, it was the pulse of the Chinampa world. Built right on an island in Lake Texcoco Tenochtitlan, depended on the Chinampas surrounding it for its food supply. The city's elite priests and warriors all feasted on produce that came from these floating farms, which meant Chinampa farmers weren't just peasants, they were essential. They kept the empire's stomach full. Deliveries flowed in daily. Canoes, stacked high with squash herbs, chilies, fish, and flowers slipped into the city's canals, docking at special market ports. From there, the goods were sold, redistributed, or taxed. Sometimes the best produce was reserved for temples or royal banquets. Other times, farmers were required to give a portion of their harvest as tribute, which we'll dig into soon. But even under imperial control, Chinampa life remained somewhat insulated. The empire might have been demanding, but out here among the water and mud, the farmer still had autonomy. You planted, you harvested, you traded, you paid your tribute, and you kept one eye on the sky for rain and the other on your neighbor's mischievous goats. And there's something poetic about how these villages blurred boundaries. The line between city and farm, home and field, sacred and mundane, it all dissolved into a watery dance. You might pick chili peppers one minute, then hear temple bells the next. Your home could have a cornfield for a backyard and a fish pond for a front porch. It wasn't perfect, of course. Floods came. Storms destroyed. Sickness spread. And sometimes, the emperor wanted more squash than anyone had patience to harvest. But for centuries, this delicate web of mudwater and human cooperation held strong. Even today, if you go to Xochimilco, one of the last remaining Chinampa regions, you can still see echoes of that past. The canals are crowded now with tourist boats and mariachi bands. But if you go early, before the music starts, you can still catch a glimpse of the original rhythm. A quiet canoe gliding through the mist. Rows of amaranth catching the first light. A farmer kneeling in soil, older than any border. It's a kind of living memory. A reminder that long before tractors and supermarkets, there were people who learned to grow floating cities with little more than mud roots and faith in the water. I'm waist deep in the muck again, but this time not from farming. Today's about conflict, because as peaceful as the Chinampa system might sound, floating, farms didn't float above politics, or jealousy, or good old-fashioned neighborly sabotage. And when you've got limited space, high demand, and a lake as your backyard, eventually someone's going to throw mud, literally. Let's set the scene. The Valley of Mexico wasn't just home to the Aztecs. Before them and around them were dozens of city-states altipedal, each with its own rulers, gods, and ambitions. Places like Chalco, Xochimilco, and Texcoco. And they all wanted control over the same resource, water. Water was everything. It irrigated the Chinampas, floated your crops to market, and nourished your people. So if you could control the flow, cut off a canal, redirect a spring, you didn't just win a tactical victory. You starved your enemies. And so began the water wars. Some of these conflicts were dramatic. Entire armies paddled into canals with spears and shields, turning what should have been a farmer's commute into a war zone. Imagine showing up to check on your chili peppers and realizing the guy from the next town over is flinging rocks from a canoe and screaming about divine rights. Other disputes were sneakier. Historians still debate whether the Aztecs strategically sabotaged rival Chinampas by opening levees or planting fast-spreading weeds. There are glyphs that hint at covert operations involving canal blockages and midnight mud dumping, basically ancient eco-sabotage. If it sounds petty, it was, but also effective. One especially juicy conflict involved the city-state of Chalco, a powerful player in the Southeast Valley. The Chalca were master Chinampa builders and proud of it. But when the Aztecs tried to impose control over their waters, particularly the flow from Lake Chalco into Lake Texcoco, the Chalca pushed back hard. There were skirmishes, embargoes, and more than one farming canoe that mysteriously sank overnight. And let's not forget the Aztec capital itself, Tenochtitlan. As the empire grew, so did its thirst. Literally, they needed fresh water and lots of it. But Lake Texcoco was mostly brackish, salty, and not great for drinking. So what did they do? They built an aqueduct to bring in clean water from springs miles away. Enter the Chapultepec aqueduct, an engineering marvel and a political powder keg. It consisted of twin stone troughs that carried spring water across the lake to the city. The problem: the pipes ran through territories that didn't exactly love being told what to do by Tenochtitlan. Sabotage attempts weren't uncommon. There are stories, some exaggerated, some not, of priests cursing the flow, rival kings ordering channels destroyed, and whole sections of pipeline mysteriously disappearing. It was like Game of Thrones, but everyone's weapon was irrigation. Even within the Aztec capital, there were tensions. Not every citizen had equal access to clean water. The elite neighborhoods near the temples got first dibs, while commoners sometimes relied on canal water for cooking and cleaning. Spoiler, that's not great when the canal is also where your neighbor dumps fish guts. And even worse during dry spells when water became so scarce that fights broke out at public fountains. And speaking of dry spells, there's the weather. The climate in the Valley of Mexico wasn't always predictable. The rainy season came from May to October, dumping enough water to flood poorly maintained Chinampas. The dry season? Bone-dry, brittle, and unkind. During drought years, water became both a necessity and a weapon. Some city-states stored reserves. Others stole them. And some farmers resorted to praying a little harder to Tlaloc the rain god, who was known for having both a generous streak and a bit of a temper. Temples to Tlaloc were everywhere, often decorated with turquoise jaguar motifs and, well, let's just say some offerings that wouldn't fly today. And while water was the big prize, mud was a close second. Chinampas needed constant replenishing. You had to dredge up fresh lake bottom muck to keep your soil fertile. But if someone blocked your access to the good silt, game over. There are records of groups fighting over mud rights, claiming ownership over specific dredging areas, the way modern developers fight over beachfront property. It was dirty business, in every sense. Let's imagine it. You've got your canoe, your basket, your long-handled silt dredger. You paddle out to your usual spot only to find a rival farmer already there, knee-deep in your mud. You glare. He smirks. A frog croaks in dramatic support. And before you know it, you're in a full-blown mud fight, slipping, sliding, and accusing each other of cosmic disrespect. Of course, not every dispute ended in chaos. The Aztecs had laws even for farming. They kept track of Chinampa ownership, water flow, and market access. If a dispute couldn't be solved with angry paddling and passive-aggressive duck placement, it went to the Calpulli, a kind of neighborhood council. The Calpulli wasn't just for mediation. It organized labor, oversaw taxes, and coordinated seasonal dredging efforts. If your Chinampa needed repairs, the Calpulli could assign neighbors to help. If you missed your water duties, they could fine you, or worse, reassign your plot. It was local government in its muddiest form. And yet for all the chaos, the system worked. Chinampa agriculture didn't collapse under the weight of petty politics. It adapted. The farmers, the builders, the water watchers, they found ways to negotiate trade compromise. Because in the end, everyone needed to eat. Sometimes, I think about those ancient conflicts when I'm stuck in modern traffic or reading the comments section of a mildly controversial recipe video. Humans, it turns out, have always found ways to argue over resources. But we've also always found ways to build things literal, or not, that float above it all. And maybe that's the real lesson of the Chinampa Wars. When the water rises, you don't fight the flood. You build a garden that floats. It's quiet on the water today, eerily quiet. Not a single paddle splash, no ducks squabbling over leftover maize, just the low croak of a frog hiding somewhere in the reeds. But don't be fooled. The Chinampas are still alive, because underneath all this floating farmland is a network even older than the squash vines and bean poles, a secret squirming, squawking ecosystem of aquaculture. That's right, these weren't just gardens. They were edible wetlands. If you think the Aztecs were satisfied growing corn and calling it a day, you've got another thing coming. They raised fish frogs, crustaceans, and even ducks right alongside their crops. Some Chinampas doubled as mini zoos, others like a swamp buffet that never closed. Let's start with fish. Small canals between the Chinampas served as natural fish nurseries. Farmers didn't build fancy pens or feeding systems. They just let the lake do what it does best, teem with life. Atherinids, little silvery fish, also called caroles, carp, and mohara, were common catches. Nets made of agave fiber were stretched across canal openings to trap the fish, and baskets were sometimes left submerged to hold them alive until dinner time. Imagine pulling your dinner out of the water like it's the produce aisle at a wet flopping supermarket. Frogs weren't just background noise either. They were dinner. Frog legs were a delicacy, especially when grilled over a fire with chili and salt. Kids often caught them by hand in the shallows laughing as the frogs tried and failed their little escape acts. And if you're thinking you frogs, well, so are snails, and the Aztecs had no problem eating those either. But let's talk about the ducks. The same ducks that earlier were public enemy number one to the squash vines. Some people didn't chase them off. They raised them. Ducks were kept in pens or allowed to nest along the calmer stretches of canal banks. Their eggs were gathered, their feathers used for blankets or ceremony, and yes, they occasionally became tamales. It was a love-hate relationship. One day, you're throwing rocks at a duck for eating your peppers. The next, you're serving him with mole sauce. And here's a weird little side note. The Aztecs weren't into dairy. No cows. No milk. No cheese wheels rolling down hills in dramatic fashion. So they turned to insects and lake foods to get their protein. Which brings us to one of the oddest and most efficient features of Chinampa life Axayacatl. These were tiny aquatic insects that lived in the lake water, and their eggs, called ahuautle, were harvested from the water's surface using woven mats. Once dried, they resembled a sort of grain and were packed with nutrients. People called them Mexican caviar, though that's a bit generous. They tasted like lake and crunch, but when mixed with ground maize and chili, delicious. Or at least edible enough to power an empire. Historians still debate whether the Aztecs domesticated certain fish species for these purposes, or simply took advantage of what was already abundant. Some argue that fish were bred selectively in controlled canal zones. Others believe the fish just hung out and multiplied like aquatic freeloaders. Either way, they became part of the food chain literally and economically. You see, fish and duck products weren't just for the family stew pot. They were tradable commodities. Alongside your squash baskets, you might also float into market with freshly caught fish wrapped in wet leaves or frog legs tied with reed string. And while produce was taxed heavily in the tribute system, some protein sources were seen as specialty items, fetching higher prices or earning special exemptions for loyal suppliers. And let's not forget the bugs. Oh, the bugs. The lake and Chinampa ecosystem was crawling with edible insects. Besides Axayacatl, There were chapulines, grasshoppers, roasted with lime and salt. There were maguey worms, which lived in the agave plant, but sometimes fell into canals during storms. And brace yourself, mosquito larvae, occasionally harvested and dried. That's right. The thing you swat at today could have been your side dish back then. Perspective. But aquaculture wasn't just about food. It was about balance. The fish ate mosquito larvae. The frogs ate insects. The birds kept the rodent population in check. And when one link in that chain got out of whack, say a flood drove the fish away, or a drought dried up a canal, the whole system felt it. That's why some Chinampa farmers kept floating plant mats on the canals. We touched on these before, but let's dive deeper. These mats were a combination of water hyacinth reeds and sometimes cultivated plants like taro or duckweed. They did triple duty cleaning the water, attracting insects which fish then ate and stabilizing water temperature. It's like building a floating refrigerator garden and bug trap all in one. And they were beautiful. Tiny islands of green, drifting through reflective water, dotted with flowers and buzzing with life. You'd pass them as you paddled to market or while fetching water for your plot. Occasionally, a heron would perch on one, as if blessing it with that long, judgy beak. Let's take a moment and imagine the scene again. You're in your canoe, gliding slowly through the early morning fog. Ahead, a floating mat of lilies drifts across your path. To your left, the water stirs as a carp breaks the surface, snatching an unlucky bug. You dip your hand into the cool canal, feel the silt between your fingers, and spot your neighbor collecting frog eggs in a basket with his daughter. It's quiet, but not silent. Peaceful, but buzzing with life, and you realize your farm is alive in every direction. Above, around, and below. This is what modern scientists now call integrated aquaponics. But the Aztecs, they just called it common sense. They didn't just plant. They cultivated ecosystems. They didn't separate land and water. They saw them as layers of the same living puzzle. And while their empires rose and fell, this floating symphony of soil and fins kept playing its song. Sometimes I wonder if we've forgotten that tune. Today, we build farms with more plastic than plants. We strip the soil, kill the bugs, poison the water, then wonder why nothing grows. The Chinampa says, look closer. Grow with the water, not against it. Maybe the frogs knew it all along. I'm squinting up at the sky. Now, not because I'm lost, but because the sky tells you everything when you're farming on a Chinampa. You learn to read its mood, the way a sailor reads the sea. The angle of the sun, the pattern of the clouds, even the way the wind smells all of it meant something. And in the Aztec world, it meant something cosmic. You see, planting wasn't just about weather. It was about calendars, ritual, and cosmic rhythm. Aztec agriculture was aligned with the heavens, and the Chinampas danced to that beat. They weren't just rows of corn and beans. They were living calendars, timed to celestial clocks. The Aztecs used two main calendars. First, there was the Tonalpohualli, a sacred 260-day cycle made up of 20-day signs and 13 numbers. It wasn't a farming calendar in the practical sense, but it told you which days were ritually appropriate for planting, harvesting, or just, not offending any gods. Then there was the Xiuhpohualli, the 365-day solar calendar, which was broken into 18 months of 20 days, each with a bonus 5-day stretch at the end known as the Nemontimi, a gloomy, spiritually dangerous time when people stayed indoors and tried not to provoke fate. No one planted during the Nemontimi. Bad luck. Probably bad crops, too. These calendars didn't just guide farmers, they governed them. Priests would consult the Tonalpohualli to determine the best day to plant maize. And if your lucky planting day happened to fall during a particularly dry stretch, well, tough. You still planted. The gods didn't wait for weather reports. Historians still debate whether the average Chinampa farmer strictly followed these rituals or whether calendar observance was more symbolic, sort of like wearing lucky socks on exam day. But there's evidence of offerings buried with seeds prayers, sung at planting, and dances performed during harvest that suggest this wasn't just for show. And it wasn't just the gods of corn and rain getting all the attention. There were gods for flowers, insects, soil, and even decay. Death and rebirth were everywhere. The Aztecs saw the natural cycle growth wrought renewal as a mirror of the cosmic cycle. Every Chinampa plot was part altar, part workshop, part clock. Let's talk crop rotation too, because the Aztecs had that down to a science. Not that they called it that, of course, but they knew that planting the same crop repeatedly in the same plot drained the soil. So they alternated. Maize followed beans. Squash followed greens. Sometimes a field would be left alone for a season to rest, a practice now called fallowing. Even in the Chinampa's muddy perfection, balance had to be maintained. The genius of it all was how this rotation synced with the calendar. The dry season saw crops that needed less moisture. The wet season brought the maize surge. Everything had its place and time, and if you got it wrong, you could lose your entire harvest. No pressure. One unorthodox detail: some Chinampa farmers used algae as fertilizer. They'd skim it from the canal surface and let it dry before crumbling it into the soil. Algae, as it turns out, is packed with nitrogen and other minerals. It's like green gold. Smelly, slimy green gold. But still. And then there was the moon. Yes, the moon played a role. Not officially in the calendars, but in folk knowledge passed down through generations. Farmers claimed that root vegetables grew better when planted under a waxing moon, while leafy greens preferred the waning phase. Sound like superstition? Maybe. Or maybe just generations of very good observational science. There's even a record of a Chinampa farmer refusing to plant squash because Venus was too close to the sun. I don't know if Venus was offended, but the squash apparently had a rough year. And speaking of ritual timing, festivals were huge. The Aztec calendar was packed with agricultural ceremonies. During the festival of Huitzilopochtli, priests cut the first ears of corn and offered them to the gods. Families would gather, sing, and eat tamales stuffed with the first harvest of the season. During Tlacaxipehualistli, warriors reenacted mythic battles, while Chinampa farmers made offerings to ensure strong spring growth. Every festival reinforced the sacredness of food. Every harvest was a gift, not a given. And when your entire livelihood depended on weather, water, and luck, that kind of spiritual structure helped you make sense of it all. Let's pause for a moment, because this isn't just about farming. It's about time. The Aztecs treated time like a garden. You didn't just move through it, you cultivated it. Each day was a seed. Each month, a harvest. You cared for it. You honored it. You paid attention. So, imagine you're kneeling on your Chinampa plot. It's early March, and the festival of Atlacawalo has just ended. You've planted your first round of maize. A tiny sprout breaks through the mud like a whisper. You smile. You mutter a quiet thank you to the gods. Then you sigh and wonder if the ducks are going to ruin it all by tomorrow morning. Because no matter how cosmic things get, there's always a duck problem. The beauty of the Chinampa system wasn't just in how it worked, but when it worked. The calendar wasn't a constraint, it was a guide. It reminded you that nature had a rhythm, and you were just one drummer in a much larger band. Even today, some farmers in Xochimilco still plant by moon phases. They still honor planting days. They still whisper to their seeds. Not because they're clinging to old ways, but because they know when you work with nature rather than against it, the harvest comes not just from the soil, but from time itself. I'm gliding slowly through the canals again, but this time I'm not stopping at the Chinampas. I'm heading straight into the beating heart of the empire Tenochtitlan, with a canoe full of squash herbs and maybe a duck or two trying to escape. Because today we're talking about commerce. Specifically, how the Chinampas didn't just feed families, they powered an entire economy. You have to understand, the Chinampa system wasn't a side hustle. It was the backbone of the Aztec food supply, the foundation of market exchange, and a quiet force behind the clatter of the capital. And in a city with over 200,000 residents, keeping everyone fed wasn't optional. It was policy. It was politics. It was profit. Let's start with the logistics. Every morning, before most of the city had stretched or scratched or shouted at a rooster, the Chinampa farmers were on the move. Canoes lined the canals like taxis at rush hour, each one loaded down with produce herbs, flowers, ducks, fish frogs, and even bundles of firewood or clay pots packed with pickled peppers. They'd float through the canals, sometimes navigating traffic jams at narrow points until they reached one of the many market landings in the city. These docks, strategically located throughout Tenochtitlan, were the ancient world's version of loading bays. From there, goods were carried by porters Tlamme to various market squares. And oh, the markets. The grandest of all was at Tlatelolco, a neighboring city district, with a marketplace so massive that the Spanish conquistadors, upon arriving, could hardly believe their eyes. Some claimed it served over 60,000 people a day, more than a Taylor Swift concert, and with better food. Every kind of item could be found there, but the produce from the Chinampas was the crown jewel. Baskets overflowing with amaranth tomatoes, avocados, squash beans, chilies in every color imaginable. You'd see stalks of maize tied with twine herbs hung like drying laundry, and piles of edible flowers laid out in perfect spirals. Aztec merchants were organized by guilds, each specializing in certain goods. The Chinampa farmers had their own respected place in this ecosystem, and while they weren't the wealthiest traders, they were among the most necessary. The entire food chain literally started with their paddles in the mud, and it wasn't just local trade. Chinampa produce fueled the tribute system, a tax-like structure where conquered city-states were required to send goods to Tenochtitlan. The central government redistributed this tribute to temples, military elites, and bureaucrats, ensuring loyalty and supplying the priesthood with more squash than they probably asked for. Chinampa crops, like maize and beans, were top tribute items. They were stable, portable, and easy to divide among recipients. Certain plots were even designated tribute Chinampas, meaning farmers worked them not for themselves, but for the empire. Your entire harvest might go straight to the royal kitchens, or to feed soldiers on campaign, or to stock the central granaries in case of famine. And let's talk currency. The Aztecs didn't have coins. Instead, they used cacao beans, cotton cloth, and other goods as barter currency. But Chinampa farmers, they made daily trades not just for money, but for survival. You might swap 5 avocados for a clay bowl, a bundle of epazote for a comb, a canoe full of amaranth greens for a new reed roof. It was the ultimate farmer's market, except you had to paddle there, dodge a priest, haggle with a flower seller, and maybe bribe a guard to skip the way station. Still, it worked. The whole economy flowed literally with the canals. What's more, Chinampas created jobs far beyond the farmers. You had boat builders, reed weavers, basket makers, porters, and market inspectors. You had people who specialized in picking flowers for ceremonial use, others who packaged herbs and banana leaves, and some who fished full-time in the canals and sold their catch at market. And let's not forget the flower economy. Yes, flowers. The Aztecs were obsessed. They used them for ritual decoration perfume and even currency substitutes during festivals. Chinampas dedicated entirely to growing Xochitl flowers sprouted marigolds, dahlias, and orchids. These floral plots were highly prized and sometimes rented out to temples or elite families during big celebrations. Imagine running a flower subscription service in 1427. 10 marigolds a week, delivered by canoe. Boom! Business. And then there were the floating markets. Some canals acted as mobile trade routes where boats drifted from neighborhood to neighborhood like food trucks on water. You could paddle down your local canal and wave down a vendor selling chili paste tortillas or a basket of frogs. It wasn't just convenient, it was a cultural experience. Think Uber Eats meets gondola. Of course, not everyone loved the economic demands. Tribute farming was hard. You might work all year and see your best produce loaded onto a cart and sent to some general you've never met. Some Chinampa farmers tried to hide part of their harvest, tucking it under blankets or behind false bottom canoes. If caught, the penalties were harsh fines, land confiscation, public humiliation. Still many endured. Why? Because the Chinampa gave them something rare in a rigid hierarchical world stability. As long as your plot produced, you had a role, a purpose, a place in the grand puzzle. You weren't a warrior or a priest or a noble, but you were feeding all of them. That came with a quiet kind of power, and sometimes that power blossomed into wealth. Some farmers expanded their plots, hired laborers, and built small empires of mud and maize. These weren't nobles, but they were influential. They had market clout. If your chilies were the best word spread, if your tomatoes always arrived spotless and right people remembered, even in a world without Yelp reputation mattered. And the best part, the Chinampa didn't require gold conquest or divine blood, just mud patience and knowing how to talk to your squash. In many ways, the Chinampa economy was a model of sustainability. It produced food, locally delivered, it without fossil fuels, recycled nutrients endlessly, and supported thousands. No skyscrapers, no spreadsheets, just floating farms and paddle-powered trade. And today, in the middle of a global conversation about food security, climate change, and sustainable systems, the humble Chinampa has started making a quiet comeback. Urban farmers look to Xochimilco for clues. Environmentalists study canal networks. Historians raise their eyebrows and go, huh, maybe they had it figured out after all. Spoiler, they absolutely did. I'm back on the water. But things feel different now. The air's heavier. There's tension drifting between the reeds, and it's not just because the frogs are fighting again. This is the moment when the humble Chinampa, the quiet floating garden, gets pulled into the great machine of empire. You see, once the Aztec Empire hit its stride, nothing stayed simple. Tribute was no longer just a civic duty. It became a machine of power, a way for the empire to remind everyone who was in charge and who would be eating the best tomatoes. At its peak, the empire ruled over hundreds of city-states, each expected to send food goods and luxury items to Tenochtitlan on a regular schedule. This tribute wasn't voluntary. It was demanded, accounted for, tracked with astonishing precision by bureaucrats who wore feathers and carried obsidian-tipped pens. And guess who became the empire's most reliable suppliers? Yep, the Chinampa farmers. They had the most fertile land, the most consistent yields. They could harvest 7 times a year, while hillside farms struggled with rocky soil and drought. So when the empire needed a steady stream of maize beans, squash chilies, and flowers, they didn't look to the highlands. They looked straight at the Chinampases and told the farmers to dig a little harder. Some Chinampas became state-managed. That meant the produce went straight to temples' military stores or the royal kitchens. And while some farmers were compensated, many weren't. They were told it was their honor to serve the gods and the emperor. You know that classic exposure gig, centuries before, it became the currency of modern artists. And it wasn't just crops. Tribute records show that Chinampa zones also had to send ducks, fish tadpoles, and flowers in exact quantities. The records were oddly specific. One town was required to send 4,000 heads of amaranth and 10 reed mats of dried chilies every month. Miss a delivery, and you'd risk penalties, or worse, a visit from the tax collectors who wore jaguar pelts and didn't joke around. Historians still debate just how brutal the tribute system was. Some say it was organized efficient and based on mutual benefit. Others argue it was extractive and left farmers exhausted, especially during years of flood drought or duck-related catastrophes. The truth is probably somewhere in the muddy middle. But one thing's clear: the Chinampas became more than farms. They became part of an imperial supply chain, one that stretched across the entire Mexico world and filled the bellies of nobles who never once planted a chili seed. And here's where things get ironic. The same floating farms that enabled the empire providing its surplus, stabilizing its food supply, feeding its armies, also made it vulnerable. Because when the Spanish arrived in the early 1500s, they targeted that exact system. Cortés and his men weren't just after gold and glory. They knew that controlling the food supply would choke the city faster than swords. So they began cutting canals, burning Chinampas, blocking tribute routes. And with every field they destroyed, Tenochtitlan grew weaker, not just militarily, but nutritionally. But we'll get to that unraveling soon. For now, let's sit with the contradiction. Imagine being a Chinampa farmer in the mid-1400s. Your plot is lush. The maize is shoulder high. You're on your third harvest of the year, but you know that most of your crop won't go to your family. It'll be loaded into canoes, rowed up to the city, and handed over to a priest who probably doesn't even know your name. You still paddle to market with the leftovers. Still try to trade for a new reed mat or a jar of salt. But the bulk of your labor belongs to the empire, and you have no choice but to keep farming. The land is good, too good, and that makes you valuable, which in turn makes you expendable. And it wasn't just about economics, it was political. Tribute reinforced hierarchy. If you sent good tribute on time, you were considered loyal. If your Chinampas underperformed, whether because of bad weather or bad luck, you were watched closely. There were even reports of surprise inspections where imperial officials would show up unannounced to check your harvest. And if you tried to game the system, say hide a few sacks of chilies under the canoe floor. We'll hope you enjoy a week of canal cleaning duty, or worse, a confiscated plot. Some farmers tried to beat the odds by forming alliances with local elites. They'd share a portion of their crop with a noble household in exchange for protection or favors. Others joined Calpulli collectives, which pooled resources and labor to meet tribute quotas. It was survival through cooperation and just a little politicking. And through all of it, the Chinampa endured, even as tribute loads increased. Even as the city's appetite grew louder, the floating farms kept producing, like loyal silent workers, mud-covered, sunburned, and rarely thanked. But that resilience came at a cost. Families who once had enough for themselves now ate less. Crops were prioritized for the empire, not for the household. Some children grew up underfed, watching boatloads of food drift past their homes, en route to people they'd never meet. And still, the farmers returned to the soil each day. Because what choice did they have? When your world floats on mud, you keep digging. That's the paradox of empire. The same Chenampa that lifts you up can also weigh you down. And yet, in the quiet moments, early morning fog, the sound of crickets, the smell of fresh maize steaming in a clay pot, the farmer still found peace. The soil still responded to his hands. The squash still bloomed. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to get him through another year of tribute. I'm drifting through the canals again, but this time, the water's darker. The air feels tense, as if it remembers. You can almost smell it, the smoke, the sweat, the coming unraveling. Because here we are at the turning point. The Chinampas didn't vanish overnight, but they were never the same after this. It starts with sails on the horizon and ends with rot in the roots. The Spanish arrived in 1519, led by Hernán Cortés, who quickly realized that Tenochtitlan was unlike any city he'd ever seen. Built on an island in a lake glittering with temples and alive with floating farms, it must have seemed like magic, or a very detailed hallucination. But Cortés wasn't here for wonder. He was here for control, and food, as always, was power. From the very beginning, the Spanish understood that taking Tenochtitlan meant taking its food systems. That meant disrupting the Chinampas. If the city couldn't feed itself, it couldn't hold. So during the siege of Tenochtitlan in 1521, one of their first major tactics was to cut off the food supply. They blocked the canals, burned storage, and destroyed boats. In some areas, they even set fire to the Chinampas, blackening the soil, killing the crops, and leaving only charred stumps where once squash blossoms had danced in the sun. And it worked. The siege lasted for months. Starvation set in. Disease spread. Smallpox, brought by the Europeans, tore through the city like wildfire. The capital, once fed by one of the most sophisticated agricultural systems on Earth, began to crumble from within. Not from swords, not from guns, but from hunger. Imagine that. You've spent your whole life nurturing your Chinampa. You know every inch of its soil. You've whispered to its beans, chased ducks from its corn, offered flowers to the gods for a good harvest. And now, your canoe is gone. Your plot is flooded or burned. Your family is starving. And there's nothing left to do but watch the empire fall. When the Spanish finally breached the city, they didn't just take the temples. They took the land, including the Chinampas. At first, they didn't know what to do with them. The floating farms didn't fit into European ideas of agriculture. Where were the plows, the fences, the grazing sheep? But hunger is a persuasive teacher, and soon enough, Spanish colonists realized the Chinampas could be useful, especially for supplying their own settlements. They reassigned plots to colonial officials, wealthy settlers, and religious orders. The farmers who had once owned or managed those plots, now laborers, or tenants, or worse, dispossessed entirely. Some were forced to keep farming under new ownership. Others abandoned the waterlogged land altogether and sought work in the growing colonial cities, and the Chinampas changed. Gone were the complex planting cycles aligned to the sacred calendar. Gone were the rituals and offerings. The gods had been outlawed, replaced by crucifixes and Spanish prayers. The delicate balance of the ecosystem began to fray. Without proper maintenance, canals silted up. Without reverence for the land, the soil compacted. Without the right hands, the floating gardens started to sink physically and metaphorically. And the new crops, let's just say they weren't local heroes. The Spanish introduced wheat, barley, and livestock that were ill-suited to Chinampa life. Cows don't do well on mud. goats eat everything. And wheat, well, it wasn't exactly fond of standing water. There were floods, too. After the conquest, the delicate hydraulic system that kept the lakes in balance began to collapse. Dikes broke. Drainage ditches clogged. In 1555, a massive flood submerged much of the valley. Chinampas were washed away. Others were buried in layers of sludge and debris. And the smallpox. It kept coming in waves. Entire families vanished. Whole communities disappeared. The population of the Valley of Mexico dropped by as much as 80% in just a few decades. And with fewer people to maintain the canals, dredge the silt, and tend the fields, the entire Chinampa system began to unravel. It wasn't a sudden collapse. It was slower, sadder, like watching a garden dry up because no one came to water it anymore. Some plots survived, of course, especially in areas like Xochimilco and Tláhuac, farther from the heart of the city. There, a few indigenous families held on passing down Chinampa knowledge in secret, keeping the old rhythms alive, even under colonial rule. But even they couldn't stop what was coming next: urbanization. As Mexico City grew, in the 17th and 18th centuries, more and more of the lake bed was drained. Roads were built. Settlements sprawled. The canals that had once been highways for squash and chilies became sewage ditches. The water grew thick with waste. Fish died. Frogs vanished. And the plants once vibrant turned pale. By the 1800s, many Chinampas were no longer floating gardens, but soggy rectangles of forgotten land, wedged between collapsing canals and encroaching concrete. And yet, some persisted. That's the strange, stubborn beauty of the Chinampa. It was designed to endure, to absorb change. Even under fire, disease, colonization, and capitalism, it found ways to survive. A few farmers adapted. They replanted maize. They raised ducks. They used old methods where they could, blending them with new tools. They didn't call themselves heroes, but they were. Today, when you stand in Xochimilco and see a lone farmer dragging his canoe down a narrow canal, you're seeing the ghost of an empire and the seed of its memory. The Chinampas may have declined, but they were never entirely erased. They live on, hidden under layers of history, beneath concrete, beneath bureaucracy, beneath the noise of a city that forgot where its food once came from. I like to think the Chinampas are still whispering. You just have to listen. I'm walking now, not paddling. And my feet are crunching on gravel instead of squishing through mud. Because where there were once endless canals, now there are roads. Where there were willows and maize stalks, now there are streetlights and snack stands. We've entered the era of forgetting the part where history sinks quietly beneath our feet. Welcome to modern Mexico City, where Chinampas still exist, but you might never know it. Beneath the asphalt, beneath the buildings, beneath the tangled grid of phone lines and honking horns, lies the memory of Lake Texcoco and the forgotten gardens that once fed an empire. Entire neighborhoods in modern Mexico City, especially on the city's eastern edge, are literally built on top of Chinampas. They don't look like floating gardens anymore. They look like suburbs or construction zones or shopping malls, but their bones still mud and reed and roots. Historians and geographers have pieced this together using aerial photos, soil cores, and old maps, some of which show strange rectangular patterns that no modern zoning plan can explain. In some places, you can still find layers of lakebed silt beneath concrete foundations. And sometimes, when a water pipe breaks or a sinkhole opens, chunks of ancient Chinampa soil resurface like a ghost rising from the canal. One of the strangest facts I've stumbled across: in parts of the Iztapalapa borough, people planting trees for modern beautification projects have accidentally uncovered Chinampa roots, literal roots. Still tangled, still fibrous, still hanging on after 500 years. It's unsettling and kind of beautiful, but it's not all mystery and nostalgia. The transformation from garden to city was messy, slow, and in many cases tragic. As the Spanish drained the lakes, the valley's water table dropped, canals dried up, wetlands turned to dust, and once that process began, it never really stopped. Today, much of Mexico City suffers from subsidence. The ground is literally sinking because the ancient lakebed is compacting under the weight of buildings. You read that right. The land we filled in is now falling down. Chinampas once floated. Now their graves are collapsing. And yet not everything was lost. Let's head south, about 20 kilometers from the Zocalo, the central square of Mexico City. Here lies Xochimilco, one of the last remnants of the original Chinampa zone. It's protected, it's recognized by UNESCO, and it still retains fragments of the old system, though they're surrounded now by highways, neighborhoods, and depending on the time of day, about 1,000 floating party boats blasting reggaeton. That's the paradox of modern Xochimilco. On one side, you have environmental scientists, ecologists, and indigenous farmers trying desperately to preserve the ancient method of Chinampa agriculture. On the other, you have tourism with brightly painted boats, trajineras gliding through the canals like floating karaoke machines. Mariachi bands hop from boat to boat. Vendors sell beer tacos and fried grasshoppers. It's not wrong. It's just layered. If you wake up early, really early, you can catch the other side of Xochimilco. The real one. The farmers who still paddle to their chinampas at dawn, just like their ancestors. They tend to their plots planting quelites, cilantro beets, radishes, and spinach. Many of them use ancestral methods, no chemicals, just lake silt organic compost, and an almost spiritual attention to the health of the soil. These are the people trying to revive the Chinampa system as a form of urban agriculture. Not for tourists, not for tribute, but for sustainability, for food security, for the health of the city. It's a hard road. Pollution is rampant. The canals are shrinking, water flow is inconsistent, and developers constantly pressure the local government to allow more construction. But somehow the farmers persist. They're the quiet resistance, the ones who remember how things used to grow. And they're not alone. In recent years, urban farming initiatives have begun to recognize the brilliance of the Chinampa model. Some NGOs and university-led projects are investing in eco-restoration, trying to reintroduce native species, clean the canals, and build new Chinampa plots in formerly abandoned zones. Some of these modern Chinampas are experimental, floating on plastic frames or incorporating hydroponics. Others try to replicate the original methods as closely as possible. It's not always successful, but it's something. Historians still debate whether the original system can ever truly be brought back. Some say it's too late. The ecosystem is too damaged, the social fabric too changed. Others believe that even a fragment of the old rhythm is worth preserving. And I can't help but agree. There's something poetic about it. In a city built on top of its own buried past, the idea that farmers still tend floating plots in the shadow of skyscrapers is both absurd and miraculous, like a sunflower pushing up through asphalt. And yet, there's still a sense of fragility. The Chinampas that remain are under constant threat. Water contamination, invasive species, land pressure, and climate change all push at the edges. One bad policy, or one good one, ignored, and what remains of this living legacy could quietly vanish. But for now, it endures. Next time you're in Mexico City, take a morning trip to Xochimilco. Not the party cruise, the real part. The one where the water's still enough to reflect the sky, and you can hear the slap of a paddle in the distance. Look for the old willow trees, the rows of greens sprouting from rich black soil. Listen for the frogs. Smell the earth. Because underneath it all, the Chinampa is still whispering. It never stopped. I'm gliding through the early morning haze in Xochimilco now, where the sun is just beginning to cast golden reflections on the canal. It's quiet just the way it used to be. No speakers, no clinking beer bottles, just the sound of water slipping beneath the canoe and the soft rustle of wind through the willows. This is where the ghost farms live. The Chinampas of Xochimilco aren't completely gone, but they've become echoes. What remains is a fragile network of survivors. Tiny plots, still cultivated by farmers who have inherited not just land, but memory. And in these final stretches, Chinampa life is both haunting and beautiful. It's a story of resistance ingenuity and a kind of quiet defiance. The farmers here are called Chinamperos, and they move through their days much like their ancestors did, albeit with a few modern twists. Some wear work boots and baseball caps instead of sandals and tunics. Some use phones to track orders for their harvests, but when they kneel in the mud, their hands are doing the same work planting, harvesting, listening to the land. They still use lake mud to nourish the soil. Still weave organic material into the beds. Still use the canals, not just for transport, but as life veins. There are no machines here, no roar of engines, just paddles, just time, just rhythm. One farmer I remember reading spends hours each week dredging the canals himself, pulling up silt to add to his plots. It's a task that was once communal, done by entire Kalpuli groups. Now, he does it mostly alone. If I stop, he said, the plot dies. But not everyone's forgotten. Universities, environmental organizations, and indigenous advocacy groups are working to support the last Chinampas. Some offer training materials or seeds. Others work to clean the canals or remove invasive species like water hyacinth. These plants grow fast, choke the water, and threaten to overwhelm the delicate balance. And yet, even in the face of these challenges, the Chinampa still does what it's always done best: produce food. Some of the best lettuce, spinach, radishes, beets, and cilantro in the valley come from these plots. Grown with no chemicals, no machinery, and a whole lot of patience. Restaurants across Mexico City pay premium prices for Chinampa produce because they know it's better. Not just in taste, but in soul. That soul runs deep. Some farmers still speak Nahuatl, the ancient language of the Aztecs. Others remember stories passed down from grandparents about planting by moonlight or how certain birds meant rain was coming. It's not just farming, it's cultural conservation. And then there's the wildlife, because somehow the Chinampa zone has become one of the last safe havens for certain species. Most famously, the axolotl, a rare amphibian, adorable in a slightly alien way, and native only to the waters around Mexico City. In the wild, it's nearly extinct. But in the cleaner stretches of Xochimilco, axolotls still swim hidden among the reeds, shy and silent. They are the Chinampa's spirit animal, ancient, strange, and stubbornly not extinct. Birds thrive here too. Herons, egrets, kingfishers. They nest in the trees that line the canals, hunt fish in the shallows, and glide across the water with a grace that seems out of place in a city so dense. If you sit still long enough, you can forget that just beyond the trees are highways, billboards, and 7 million people who may never see this side of their city. Historians and ecologists still argue about what Xochimilco should be: a living museum, a nature reserve, an agricultural revival, a tourist destination. The truth is, it's all of those things, and none. It is what it has always been, a landscape made not by dominance, but by cooperation. Humans and water, roots and mud, ducks and dreams. There's a certain poetry to its persistence. The Aztec Empire is long gone, its temples shattered, its gods silenced, its calendars reduced to curiosities. But the Chinampa, this floating, breathing, mud-born miracle, still exists, still feeds, still listens. Of course, there are threats. Water contamination from the city seeps into the canals. Developers pressure local governments for more space. And climate change. It's coming for everything. Droughts, irregular rains, new pests, rising temperatures, all stress a system already hanging by a reed thread. But the Chinampa isn't fragile. It's flexible. It was designed to float through change, to adapt, to recover. The roots run deep, and the people tending them know what they're doing, even if the world around them forgets. I met a young Chinampero in a documentary once who said the land remembers, even if no one else does. He was 24, educated, could have taken a job in the city. Instead, he paddles through canals each morning, tends to plants, pulls weeds, and explains the importance of soil microbiomes to curious kids on weekend tours. He believes in the future of the Chinampa, and maybe that's the key. The past doesn't disappear. It hides. It waits. It teaches those willing to listen. And here in the soft light of morning, where the frogs croak, the birds hunt, and a young man pulls amaranth from the soil, you realize something incredible. The Chinampa never died. It just went quiet. And now it's whispering again. I'm paddling slower now, not because I'm tired, but because I don't want to leave. The mist still clings to the canal's surface like a memory refusing to burn off. Around me, the Chinampas stretch quietly into the horizon. No crowds, no applause, just soft ripples, willow shadows, and the hum of life below the surface. This is the final stretch, the part where everything slows down. So much of history is told through empires, wars, kings, and collapse. But the Chinampa story, it's told in rows of lettuce, in mud-caked hands, in quiet morning harvests that never made it into the grand epics. And yet here we are, 1,000 years later, still learning from it, because the Chinampa wasn't just a method, it was a philosophy. It taught that land didn't have to be conquered. It could be coaxed. That food didn't need to be extracted. It could be invited. That the best systems weren't rigid, but resilient. That mud and water, when paired with human patience, could become something sacred. Even now, scientists study Chinampas to understand how to grow food in harmony with nature. Urban planners dream of replicating their water efficiency. Climate activists point to them as ancient blueprints for a sustainable future. Floating gardens might just outlive the skyscrapers after all. But the real miracle, it's the people. Generation after generation, through conquests, floods, colonialism, neglect, pollution, and politics, they kept showing up. Paddling through the canals, whispering to the soil, chasing ducks, replanting, rebuilding, remembering. And they're still here, not as reenactors, not as museum pieces, but as living farmers feeding a modern city from medieval roots. Sometimes I wonder what those first Chinampa builders would think if they could see the world now. Would they laugh? Cry? Shake their heads at the jet skis and the mariachi boats? Or would they just nod quietly, recognizing the persistence, the rhythm, the mud that never gave up? I like to think they'd smile, not because everything turned out fine, it didn't, but because something survived, something humble, something good. In the end, the story of the Chinampa isn't about floating farms. It's about a way of being, a way of growing, a way of respecting the world, not as a resource to be exploited, but as a partner to be listened to. In that story, it's not over. There's a little girl out there right now in Xochimilco. She's learning to plant beans. Her grandmother is teaching her how to listen to the birds, how to read the sky, how to turn canal muck into life. She doesn't know she's part of an ancient system. She's just helping with dinner. But one day, she'll understand. And maybe, just maybe, she'll teach her children too. Because mud remembers, and water forgives, and the Chinampa. It waits for no one but welcomes everyone back. So now, here we are at the edge of the water, watching the last light dip behind the Chinampa trees. Everything's a little softer. The frogs are still singing, the canals have gone still, and even the ducks for once have quieted down. This is the part where we slow things down completely. The air cools. The scent of earth and lake settles in. A paddle leans gently against a canoe, forgotten. Somewhere a candle flickers on a tiny altar, left as an offering for another good harvest. You can almost hear the lullaby of a world that hasn't stopped, just shifted into a slower rhythm. Let the noise of modern life fall away. Let your breath match the gentle sway of the water. Inhale, as if the night air still carries the memory of maize blossoms. Exhale like the wind moving through willow leaves. Everything that mattered is still here, beneath the roots within the soil, floating quietly in the in-between. Rest now. The Chinampas will hold your story too.